Well, hello, world. This is Jonathon Feit, co-founder and chief executive of Beyond Lucid Technologies, coming at you with another Facebook Live stream for the Sacred Cows and Data Cubes podcast. I am thrilled to be joined by the recently retired Mike Touchstone, Chief Mike Touchstone. I am going to ask Mike to introduce himself for the 2 to 3 people in this industry who don't already know him and don't already feel as I do about him, which is that this is a man of intense wisdom. When I think about what I want to be, it's the ability to switch seamlessly between an eloquent discussion of education and policy and healthcare and bourbon and culinary arts and travel around the world. And so when I think Renaissance man, I think Mike Touchstone. So Mike, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, a couple minutes here on your background. We'll talk about what the topics are for today.
Wow. Yeah, so I retired from the Philadelphia Fire Department EMS division as Deputy Chief of EMS Operations in September past, hence having facial hair, which is prohibited by policy in the fire department. I served 32 and a half years there. Prior to that, I was a lieutenant and shift supervisor at a hospital-based 911 responding ALS service in Delaware County. And I started at a volunteer corps Narberth ambulance in 1980. I got my paramedic certification in 1983. It's a long time ago.
It feels like yesterday. If you have that same time warp experience that I do, you remember some things like yesterday.
Oh yeah, I still have
yesterday feels like a long time ago. What?
I still have my Nancy Caroline second edition textbook.
Nice.
So, I mean, I've also done a lot of stuff outside. I taught management of EMS at the National Fire Academy. I was president of the National EMS Management Association back in the middle 2000s. Played with NEMC because I was an instructor. Did a lot of stuff on their committee work. I've been involved in the Pennsylvania Emergency Health Services Council, which is the advisory council here in Pennsylvania. I was regional director of the city of Philadelphia for the EMS office, CQI officer. I was the director of the Philadelphia Fire Department EMS Training Institute. And yeah, I like bourbon, I like to cook, I like gardening, you know, a lot of other stuff. So yeah, if that qualifies as a Renaissance man, I guess, yeah.
I would say so. Like I said, I look at your career and I think #life goals. So certainly take the compliment. It's meant as one. But I also think, given the topics that we want to talk about here, which you and I have had over years in a setting prior to the existence of this podcast, I thought there are few people more and better equipped, having seen the gamut of this industry's educational settings, who understand its challenges, who understand its politics, which are enough to knock you sideways and potentially make the US Congress look like a happy-go-lucky playground. And I just said that on record, right? I think what I want to dig into is some of the practical and philosophical realities. There's just a lot of psychology that comes in our industries, the hills that people die on, let's say. And I think when it comes to education, both education per se, meaning what you might get in a school, and also education on the job, how do we, as you and I have talked about in many settings, including through the Congress of Mobile Medical Professionals, which we'll talk a little bit more later, this archipelago theme of sharing knowledge between different places, right? that's a more practical aspect of education and training, where what you're doing in Philly and what they're doing in Texas and what they're doing in Los Angeles and in rural spaces in between may have relevance to one another. Right. We have to, I want to talk today about all of those things. How do we bridge the gaps? Because we are struggling as an industry with retention. We are struggling with recruitment, right? We are struggling with a data-driven practice, which requires people to learn how to do things differently. And you have been on the front, and I'm going to show some things on my screen today, but this is a document, the cover page of a document that I always associate with you. I think one of our first in-depth conversations was about this concept, sort of what makes a leader. But particularly when one looks at mobile medicine, and while there are differences, again, we'll talk about it today, but we've talked about it before, the differences between fire and EMS in terms of the structure of the teams, right? How many people go out on a call, for example. And now with community paramedicine, we're sort of slimming down teams even more, but sometimes we're combining with police or other social resources, right? So there's a reconfiguration of what it means to be a leader. I think we want to talk about a little bit of all of that, because
I want to throw down a couple of challenges, right?
Go ahead.
So first, how we refer to what it is that we do is critically important. The labels and the nomenclature used to describe what we do. And there have been arguments about calling what we do paramedicine that have made it to the federal level, and we haven't really made any progress. But one of the things I think, take umbrage with perhaps is the fact of calling what we do an industry. Okay. And industrial processes have a certain connotation of workers making products. And if anything, if we're any kind of industry at all, we're a healthcare industry and a more along the lines of hospitality. We provide service, we don't make stuff. And the drive towards professionalization, I think, has a lot to do with moving away from this idea of an industrial concept, because you only need training to be successful as a worker in a factory, right? You only need your basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. And if we want to proceed past being simple technicians, this is where we get into this idea of what's a profession and what's professional, not the same thing. And are we an industry or are we a profession, aspiring profession? Allergies are brutal. The other thing is when you talk about data in and of itself is of very little use until it's been analyzed. And from that data, you develop actionable intelligence. Data is useless without analysis. So we often talk about data, but we really don't talk much about how to use it and how to turn it into intelligence and how to make the outcomes of the study of the data actionable. So we live in a world of dichotomies. Many of them are false dichotomies. You talked about training a lot, the training and education dichotomy. Well, it's not really a dichotomy. You need them both, right? Teacher versus taught. Well, data versus intelligence. Industry versus profession. The macro and the micro, the strategic and the tactical. We're working in a very complex environment with a lot of things that are not properly or very well understood, and things are not clearly defined. So one of the things, as I will segue from discussing those pieces, is what's the role of education? So in the process of becoming better able to understand, to argue, to have dialogue, to participate in a dialectic or other aspects of the things that we need to do. Yeah, there you go. So go ahead and follow up on that, because that's an important foundation of.
Yeah, no, I think I'd like you to dig into that. I mean, clearly, I was just taking notes. There's clearly quite a bit to unpack there. What I have on screen here for all watching is a definition from an article through a website called Masterclass, which they're not paying me to say this, but I absolutely am obsessed with their service. So to the degree that anyone hasn't heard of or tried Masterclass, it's just fascinating to learn from people that you would otherwise not get to learn from, perhaps. And when I was coming up, and let me preface by saying that my bias with respect to education per se is informed by the fact that I only have 3 degrees and a couple of other certificates and whatnot along the way, graduate certificates. I tend to think that in our practice, which I think it's an interesting point that you point out, profession versus industry, makes me wonder, for example, where I fit. Right, I'm not a medic, I'm not a firefighter, I'm a data guy, kind of pervading this practice, kind of on the periphery. So that's probably worth coming back to. Kind of, if we are a profession, then where do the affiliates who are not directly part of that profession sit? And I think that's worth perhaps a discussion here. But when I was coming up in school, one of the things that I remember most fundamentally learning is the ancient Greek view of education as an end unto itself. There was an association between education and happiness, which is an interesting way of looking at things. I think kind of the concept of homework doesn't really fit into that. But
well, the other thing about it's not just about happiness, but how you can contribute to society.
Well, happiness was not described the same way. So happiness it wasn't a matter of feeling smiley. It was the association of happiness. It was more about satisfaction, what in the psychology world we might call self-actualization, right? So are you, as you can see right here,
hierarchy.
I'm sorry?
Maslow's hierarchy.
Indeed, so Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? The pinnacle of that being the self-actualization. And it was really an association between being able to contribute, and that the idea of being a positive contributing member of society was a good thing. And in order to do that, you needed to be able to participate, to sit at the table, to engage in conversation. And so education was all about that. And you kind of see it here summarized, really in a way that I think we probably nowadays are putting under the revised acronym of STEAM education: science, technology, education, arts, and mathematics. But what's really so interesting there is, on the one hand, the clear engineering orientation of that. Thankfully, the arts being thrown in because it does enrich life in a significant way to be able to have a conversation that's not just about equations. But the idea that if you can't communicate what you are doing and why it matters and why what you did mattered, then, a tree fell in the forest. And I know that one of the points that you have a lot to say about, so I'm going to tee this up for you, is Liz Angeli's article that she spearheaded with a number of extraordinary colleagues about the question of whether folks are able to communicate to the degree that is appropriate and necessary in this industry, and B, do people think they are better communicators than they in fact are? Right, and this sense of, as you go along, and I saw Tom Boothaway had something out on social media today, who recently retired from Hilton Head Fire, had something out circulating around the self-knowledge that comes over the course of a career, and how by the end of a career you realize how little you actually knew relative to how you may have felt when you just came out of your training program and you were green, but you thought you were a hotshot. And I think those jive with some of Liz's findings. So why don't you speak a little bit to that in terms of the self-awareness bit?
Let me start with this idea of the Greek process. And in there, you'll notice a word, pedagogical. And that is relevant to the teaching of children in a teacher-taught mode. most of, that's like elementary school and high school. When you start dealing with adults, which is what we often are dealing with, you move to a different style of education called Andragogy, whereby you don't have a passive audience, you have a bunch of grown-ups with experience who need to know why I have to learn this. So that goes very much to the idea, why should I get a degree? I'm not going to get paid more. Well, we can get into the whole, is it about pay or is it about how that argument fits? I would argue in my own career, while I was nickel and diming my education to my bachelor's degree, I was promoted lieutenant, captain, battalion chief, and division chief. And I would attribute my success in part to the fact that I was studying this stuff and writing about it and reading about it all the time. So I was able, as you said, to communicate, because what we did in class was communicate via writing. The things that were written about in Liz's article and the premise, let me give just a little brief background, and you can bounce back to Andragogy now, and then I'll come back to the article because it's important. Well, okay. So it's a legit scientific study from the perspective of the fact that it was reviewed by a review board at a university. They collected data via a survey. And this particular article basically says, or the findings were, that providers don't feel prepared. They don't feel prepared in many of the dimensions of the work that we do. Now, they based the topic areas on a position paper that was put out in pre-hospital emergency care.
Yep.
About, it was titled EMS Curriculum Should Educate Beyond a Technical Scope of Practice, Position Statement and Resource Document. Now, interestingly enough, only one of the authors is a medic. The rest are DO, MD, EDD, and so forth. But they identified several areas that needed to be addressed: public health and epidemiology, social determinants of health, social equity and bias, mental and behavioral health, culture of safety and human factors science, quality improvement, healthcare business and finance, leadership and change management, evidence-based practice, and effective communication skills. Now, when you go down that list, our current guidelines that direct all of the paramedic programs that are certifying or preparing people for certification don't include any of those things. It's all driven by clinical skills and knowledge. You'll hear discussions of affective domain amongst educators. That's about values, attitudes. That's not part of the curriculum either. And that's been discussed literally for decades. Why do we have this gap in our preparation of practitioners where attitude and values are critically important? And that comes to play when you have practitioners who generate complaints, not about their clinical care, but about their attitude, their tone of voice, their posture.
Bedside manner.
Well, it's all about bedside manner. So the article that Liz is the lead author on addressed those areas, and basically most of the people who responded to a high level, 2/3 felt moderately, slightly, or not at all prepared across those 13 areas by their initial education. And part of what you said earlier, the more well-educated the providers, the more they realized how poorly they were prepared. So
well,
the more they knew, the less they realized they were provided in the beginning.
Well, and that's actually where I think, again, hopefully this is as controversial as it should be. And if I haven't if I haven't kicked the hornet's nest in a 24-hour period, I'm slacking, so I got to get on that apparently. But I have, especially in a time when we are increasingly data driven, for information driven and pure data numbers driven in this industry, right? I am not a medic. I am not a firefighter. I am a data geek. And that's a topic about which I'm competent to discuss, right? But I also have spent a good deal of time in school, and I find it often ironic that many of the most vocal proponents, advocates, table bangers, whatever you want to call it, for needing folks to go get degrees, for example, are either not very formally educated, which is interesting, or are formally educated and have other reasons to feel as though they, if but they had this other thing, they would have advanced to some other place. And it almost becomes an overcompensation conversation, because the question of whether you obtained a degree or two or three is often itself a red herring. The association of, now I do buy, and I think this is very apropos of things, that getting a degree can be a demonstration of commitment, right? That's for sure. Right? If you
also a demonstration of a body of work, right? That you've done something. Now I'm going to say this, it doesn't make you smarter.
Agreed. And it doesn't get you paid more either, which is
it can get you paid more.
Can, not necessarily. Right.
Depending upon what you want.
Exactly.
The reason and the rationale for getting it, and see, I would separate, a degree is just the marker that you've been educated, right? It just shows that you've written, you've read, you've done some critical thinking, you've had some arguments, and it represents a breadth and depth of knowledge that you would have a hard time getting any other way. So and most of the arguments against education in EMS are not against education per se, they're against requiring a degree. And I would say that, a lot of the arguments are both straw man arguments based on unsupported assertions, but it's almost irrelevant. We have some science that says that a better educated practitioner is going to provide better care. They try and say there isn't, but I would argue there is. And on its face, a better educated person has potentially a better foundation upon which to build practice. So yes, this is a lot of times a circular argument. A lot of times there are dichotomies and false dichotomies. There's fallacies. There's all kinds of crazy stuff. And I'm gonna hit one of the topics that I am passionate about, and that is the fact that this is exceptionally complex. So you get into this idea of complexity and problems that are insoluble. Wicked problems is the term that was developed in the 70s in public policy. And anybody who's out there that's listening to this that wants to get an idea as to why we're not making progress and why we're not solving problems, take a look at some articles or Google wicked problems and read some of the stuff, because we haven't articulated what the problems are properly. So let's say that one of the biggest problems that's a perennial discussion is recruitment and retention. Okay, so first off, right out of the box, those are not the same problem. Recruitment and retention are two separate things. Secondly,
and let's be sure we're going to put a pin in the rotational training bit that we're going to talk about and define.
Right. So when we talked about this at a Pinnacle conference in an open conversation about the recruitment and retention issue, and to start thinking about, well, why do we perceive a problem of recruitment and retention, and how do we solve the problem? We came to the understanding that the problem, one of the biggest components of the problem is an educational problem. People don't understand, A, what they're getting into. We don't tell them the truth about what EMS is. We prepare them only to do certain aspects of the job. And, you know, when you can hold this position as a high school graduate or a GED holder and expect, if you get a degree, to get more money, that's not going to happen. But I can tell you that you're also not going to get more money if you don't. And the chances of making progress are improved when you have an education. When you go up, if you want to get a better job and you're competing against somebody, or you're competing for a promotion, if you're more well prepared and you can argue your point and you can convince people that you know what you're talking about and can do what you say you're doing, you're going to get promoted. And as I said earlier, I was promoted because I did that every day for months and years. And I could talk about stuff that other guys that hadn't had that experience couldn't talk about. If all you knew or all you know is the department you're in or the environment, the narrowly focused environment that you live in, you're not going to do well. And it goes to that sort of Renaissance approach. We very often are only informed by ourselves. And we need to look to other disciplines. And that also goes to the Greek approach. It's not unidimensional, it's literature, it's arts, it's physical activity, you know, wrestling or running or, you know, physical activities. We don't do enough of that. We don't take information about similar situations that other disciplines have solved and incorporate it into our own progress towards professionalization. Now, I don't know if anybody, you know, what people's thoughts are about making paramedicine a profession, but you want to get more money, look at what they've done in other English-speaking countries where degrees have become mandatory. Well, not so much, they didn't say they're mandatory, but that's the only way you get to be a paramedic is you go to paramedic school at a university.
Well, let me throw a hitch in there a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
Our on the one hand, I think the American education system and versus, for example, Commonwealth country education system, it is probably we could have a college course all about that in and of itself.
Oh, sure. And their healthcare systems are different too.
Indeed. So I mean, it's a bit of an apples and oranges thing. Speaking of strawman arguments, I always find it you know, interesting when folks look to Canada, UK, Australia, Ireland, etc. And well, there's so many apples to oranges there that it's very difficult where you're looking, for example, a nationalized health system where you don't have a clear separation between high school and college, right? And when people look to Israel, where you're going to have military experience in between, which does a lot for teaching you about the world. So, and others like Chief John Deckers of the Westwood Fire Department at one point, when I interviewed him, talked about how great it has been to hire people in his department who had a different career before they joined the fire service, right? Because they brought that life experience. But I think to your point about the education bits and the value of having something that shows that commitment and breadth of experience, I think one of the challenges I've often had, and I hope maybe a takeaway, maybe it's in the comments. I mean, you know, we'll see if Jeff brings us questions at the end. But I think one of the missing pieces of this that would do it for me is if folks would define what degree or education scope should be included. Because this is why I punched in there, because you mentioned about a degree in paramedicine, right? But one of the most important trends that I think we're seeing in healthcare in general, which includes in mobile medicine, is the recognition of the social determinants of health, right? And so I have found it unendingly problematic when folks talk about either getting a degree in a practical subject. I think, and I don't want to call it, well, whether it's paramedicine or fire science or whatever it is, those are practical subjects as I would define them, right? As opposed to, is it more important or math, by the way, or statistics, or any of the things that the business, etc. Is it more important to have a degree in psychology, in sociology, right? In the ability to relate to your patient, as opposed to understanding how the parts connect inside the patient. And I don't think they're separate. I think they're combined. But are we negating the value of one by not defining the range of applicable intellectual traits that someone needs to have in this industry?
I would suggest that if there was a degree program devised, that there would be, as in many programs, core competencies that need to be included. Things like ethics, things like leadership and management. I can't remember all of the ones, but you can create a core of 5 or 6, some statistics.
How are these?
Well, they're very close, but that's not broad enough. That's very focused into what supervising, managing, and executive EMS officer needs to know.
Let's push on that a little bit, because honestly,
let me just get to what I was getting to there.
Go ahead.
Because there are areas of study that could be included as threads of an educational process to reach a degree. You could have a generalist in EMS, you could have somebody who focuses on education.
Yeah.
You could have somebody who focuses on quality improvement. You could have somebody who focuses on clinical stuff.
Yeah.
You could have somebody who focuses on research, that builds a curriculum, a personal curriculum around a core set of competencies that you need to be effective as a practitioner, so that, and we do need to look towards a much broader range of influences: psychology, sociology, genetics, pathophysiology, all the medical ologies. We don't get into, and the real underlying difficulty is in the amount of time it takes to create a trained technician, to kick them out onto an ambulance and set them up to be uncomfortable and unprepared is really, in my opinion, an unethical approach, not only for the practitioner, but for the patient. And one of the things we lose on many of these conversations is, where does the public fit? Now, you go back to our Greek idea that you're a contributing member of society. What is it that you're contributing to society when you come out of paramedic school? I mean, you're going to respond to emergencies? Not so much. That's what we tell them. You're going to respond to people's requests for help, most of which are not an emergent medical or traumatic injury, a problem like that. So you want to push on the 7 pillars? I mean, I was one of the people engaged in doing that, although I can't take credit for making it happen. That goes to Ryan Greenberg. And there was a lot of foundation work. If you you can find this document online.
That's how I found it. Yeah, and it's 95 pages long. This is the cover page.
Right.
But the reason I'm suggesting to push on it is I think what you've said is fascinating in ways that are only now emerging, I think. So, for example, again, when I think about the flavors of mobile medicine that are emerging, right? Community paramedicine / mobile integrated health / whatever else we want to call it this week, right? When we think about pediatrics, right? I mean, I have a specific professional focus in my work around pediatrics with special health needs, so children with medical complexity. And would it be interesting? I mean, how one structures that into formal training, I think, is almost a separate question. But how interesting it would be to see a recruitment poster, right? A LinkedIn ad, a Indeed posting, whatever it is, that says, we know that in our community, we have children with underlying severe disease, right? We have children with sickle cell. We have children with lymphomas and other forms of cancer. We have children with a variety of epilepsy and autism and muscular dystrophy.
Well, there's all kinds of chronic illnesses plus
right.
the other stuff that comes up that happens to kids.
But imagine if we said, we are looking for somebody who understands how to intubate and medicate and all those things, the ologies, as you put it, but also who has a concentration somewhere in their experience, life or training, with young kids, right? And we're going to specialize it. Have you ever seen something like that says, we need you to have the sensibility, not just the training. We need you to understand how to relate to the older folks, the bilingual, the folks who don't speak English, the folks who can't speak because they're too young.
The hearing impaired.
Sure. Look, I'm a person with disability. I'm a twitchy guy. I will tell you, like, if for all those in the world, if you don't already know, A, I have Tourette syndrome. B, if my screen looks twitchy, it's me, not you, I promise. Right? So to not adjust your set. Right? So I have been on the receiving end of being thrown against a wall because a peace officer thought that I was on substances because I'm a twitchy guy. Right? The context being similar, like we're starting to talk about relating to members of the polis, right? When you talk about the community in the Greek fashion and the politics, understanding political science, understanding when people get upset about the question of, do we call the thing excited delirium or not? Why is that important to the communities that are touched? And do we train people in this industry to engage sufficiently that conversation?
Look, first of all, it's not training. Training would be how you throw the guy up against the wall. The educational component is how you decide whether or not to do it. And we don't talk about it. We talk about how to stick the needle. Right?
How do we get to that point?
Well, look, it begins when you talk about like a pediatric specialist. Before you can have a specialist, you have to have somebody who's a competent generalist. They got to know the foundational theories, concepts, principles, structures as to how to do the foundation job, the basic job of being a paramedic and out of hospital medical provider. We don't have a strong foundation yet before you can build off into somebody who's a mental health professional or that. And we don't work very much with them, right? Who has integrated mental health professionals into, and it's coming, SEPTA's doing it here in Philadelphia. We have a opioid special response unit that has social workers and mental health professionals, but it's one unit in the city. And we have to get the 300,000 people taken care of before we worry about the 0.102%.
That's it. So again, this is an interesting point. So I just had a conversation literally about 30 minutes before we started this discussion with some Jeff will attest to this because I pitched him another podcast all about it. The conversation was with folks from the United States Fire Administration in FEMA.
USFA, yeah.
USFA, right? So I'm assuming not everybody knows the acronyms, but let's go with US. Yes, so USFA.
And it has a new director, by the way.
What was that?
Who has a new director, by the way.
And it's something you want to discuss? What? Is it something you want to talk about with respect to?
No, I'm just saying the director of the USFA has an EMS focus to some degree.
Awesome. Well, and I think good, right? That's a good thing. What was really intriguing, and I have a particular love for the movie Contact. Have you seen Contact?
Probably. I don't.
Jodie Foster's, anyway. The fabulous movie, one line everybody should know. The question is, what is the first rule of government contracting? And the answer is, why build two? Why build one when you can have two or twice the price? Right. So why build one when you can have two or twice the price? And so, did you say it's an awful movie and yet you watch it every time?
Is that the one with a weird spaceship and they go in and the aliens like slap their fingers up against the glass wall?
No.
Is that Contact?
No, that I know that's which one you're talking about. That's not that. We'll have to look that one up.
That's terrible non sequitur. Get back on track there.
Okay. So this was interesting because the conversation with USFA, one of the things we discussed was when we're talking about folks with special health needs, right? And ventilators came up in conversation. And so they said, wouldn't it be awesome if there was a way for fire and EMS professionals and police, sheriffs, et cetera, depending on where you are, to know that if there's a power outage, who you need to go engage, who you need to check in on, because the power went out, they're on a vent. And so you need to make sure that they're okay. And you'd have a list of who those people are. That came from USFA. And I said, but there is such a thing. Yes. And it sits in ASPR, right? And so if you've got these, and the folks that I was talking to have been in government for a long time. So cross communication about how we're doing things right in one place versus another, right? The academy isn't great about this, right? The academy's kind of horrible about this.
Which academy are you talking?
In general, academia. In general,
okay.
Right? I mean, every university for themselves, right? But people go to conferences and they pitch their ideas, and you know, if you've had a published paper in whatever, you know, maybe you get picked to present. In our, again, I don't know what to call it. If you don't want to call it an industry, what am I calling this? Our space, our ecosystem. So we have a challenge of the same people talk a lot. Yep. Right. The same people tend to talk about similar things a lot. And then you have identified very eloquently that there are whole spaces that are emerging yet never get presented. And so the awesomeness that's happening in the Pacific Northwest and comparable awesomeness happening in the Southeastern US, the Deep South, may never hear about one another. And so we end up replicating and keep ourselves from advancing without, I dare say, if I'm going to pat Jeff Frankel on the back for this, because it's his idea to do this for him, so good on you, buddy, is without forums like this, and thank goodness for social media, words rarely spoken, right? We have the ability to communicate from expertise out of your area in Philadelphia and have it reach the world. And what do we do to ensure that the range of competencies not only keep us, we won't want to skim across the top, right? We also want to make sure that each community knows how to find its people. And without infrastructure to do that, how are we doing that? Mind you, we've been in an ecosystem, if not an industry, for 50-something years now, right?
Right. So look, there's a
point
couple
at which you get to stop saying you're new, right? I mean, it's not new anymore.
There's a couple things we need to do, right? First of all, and this is a very controversial statement, but the United States Fire Administration is the fire administration. Where's the United States Paramedical Administration?
The Office of EMS at NHTSA?
Yeah, but that's under the Department of Transportation, and they are limited in their scope and authority.
You know, I made a point on that a couple of weeks ago that I hope we can dig into it now if you'd like. I'm happy to go longer today, but I think the more I said this during the FACPE meeting, the interagency communication thing, right? That the more I think about where HHS is going at the federal level, the more I think if EMS were in that line, it would be a fish out of water. It wouldn't fit. DOT is exactly
suggesting that where
Homeland
it
Security
to go, but the Department of Transportation is where it ended up because that's where the money came from to write the original curriculum.
Sure.
So the other thing we need to get those ideas and those concepts out, we have one peer-reviewed journal currently that primarily focuses on clinical work, pre-hospital emergency care. There is in the works a new journal called the International Journal of Paramedicine that will be addressing the non-clinical stuff as a primary focus, as well as clinical.
Does that mean social determinants? Does that mean?
It means all of that. All the things we just talked about are issues.
Yes, Jeff, we know that JEMS is peer reviewed too. But I don't think JEMS is quite as nerdy as the pure academic. I mean, you let me in, man. Peer-reviewed journals don't let me in.
You know, the academic rigor of various journals can be debated. I don't remember, and it's been a while. I mean, I can argue that I don't remember anybody looking at my stuff when I submitted it.
For better and worse, JEMS has a readership of more than 12 people. So when it compares to most academic journals, you're rocking, man.
But what my point being that we need to have a vehicle for those communications.
Yeah.
So journals, if you're going to move to be in a profession, you need to have research. You need to develop an esoteric body of knowledge that's supported by conversations and dialogue, that we critically look at the ideas of what it is that we do and why we do it. That's how we move this stuff forward.
Well, so again, let me push on that a little bit, because one of the challenges that I have, and I have this in a non-commercial sense, in an academic sense, is I have been seeing more and more academic research data-oriented conversations where the data, for example, are being provided by this company or that company, right?
Based on their software, their EPCR software.
Right, and I find myself worrying because of some of the points you made earlier about perhaps the lack of understanding on how to get away from bias, right? That if you have a million charts coming out of one software system, you have a sample size of one, right? Now, you have some breadth, so you can make some statistical statements, but have we adopted sufficient understanding to say, for example, let's say you're an agency that uses ESO and an agency that uses ImageTrend and an agency that uses Zoll, right? Is there something about your agency and your practice and your region and whatever that drew you toward that system, right? Academically speaking, statistically speaking, that could be a confounding error, right?
Sure.
You need to accommodate for that. And
now,
yet,
theoretically, NEMSIS crosses all.
It does, but NEMSIS, if NEMSIS is providing the data, but more and more we're seeing an alignment of, again, where companies are hiring researchers. And again, I'm not going to name any specifics here, but your point about the need for research is critical. And yet there are people, I'll mention Brooke. If I say Brooke, you know who I'm talking about, right?
Oh, I didn't.
Right, but across this industry, people do. It's a very dangerous place for an industry with a national and international scope to have our equivalent of a Michael Jordan, right? You shouldn't be able to have a first name basis where one name denotes a researcher, because that means we don't have enough of them, right?
Look, that's my point exactly, right?
Yeah.
When you start talking about, and this is another aside, down the EPCR line, a lot of the stuff that was originally driving electronic patient care reporting was demographic and billing data. And the ability to have a high quality transfer of clinical and important medical knowledge via a narrative, which was how it was done in the past, has been by and large lost, which is a problem. It makes it harder to extract data from a narrative. So you make a narrative generated based on the pick list. And I can go down this whole rabbit hole about how we do patient care reporting and what the data points are and what we choose to include and not include. So far, in my opinion, it's not very well crafted for transmitting the important medical data. Whole other story, right?
But actually, let's not go away from that too fast, because I did want to make sure in the time that we have, we talk about this concept of rotational trading. And I think
explain what you mean by that.
I will. So I don't have a better word for this, but the simple fact is people come and go from agencies a lot, right? And I, as a guy who engages in deployments, I have for technology, but it wouldn't matter if it was technology or if it was, laryngoscopes. It doesn't matter. We have we have a practice, a standardized practice around. I'm going to catch me on the industry thing all the time now, by the way, make my life difficult here. I've lost a word. So we would talk about train the trainer models, and I think that's, so now you know exactly what I'm talking about. I had an experience as a company where we did a train the trainer, and then the trainer left, and nobody else was there. Right now, forgetting the fact of like this person left to another agency, we're in the age of COVID, right? People get hurt on the job, right? There's all sorts of many reasons, but it's a really serious problem that organizations ask companies to come in and do a training when you stand up the person, the whatever it is you're doing, right? You deployed in a region, you have a new technology, you have a new tool, you have a new this, you
They've done that over and
right.
over and over.
But whereas actually I think there are, when it comes to clinical skills, and I think the fire service is really good at this, so you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think every so often you do refreshers on things, right? But when it comes to the stuff that we do every day, like EPCR work, right? Not only is there oftentimes very little understanding about the guts and the why and all that, and I'm working on that separately from this as to help people explain the purposes and the value and all that stuff, but people train each other, right? And so you can find out that I mean, there are still jurisdictions that are putting 5 and 10 year software contracts in place, which is just insanity to a tech guy. I mean, you know, but how do we train the next folks when people come and go and people learn from each other, which may mean they learn bad habits. And as an industry that deals with this every day, we still don't have best practices that I've found, and I've asked this question of many people except you on record. So you're going to solve my problem today. Is what is the
one
best?
Of the things you have to recognize, what you're pointing out is what leads to what's called normalization of deviance.
Okay.
I'm
a normal deviant. Is that weird?
It has to do with, and you know, you can Google it. It has to do with why the Challenger happened and why the Columbia happened. They're the two areas of normalization of deviance that led to enormous public tragedy and loss of life. But it's a concept that is created by what you're talking about, the sort of whisper down the lane changes that happen when I train you, you train John, John trains Sally. They don't think you know what you're talking about, so they're going to add their own little twist to it.
It's a game of telephone.
Say again?
Game of telephone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, there you go. Normalization of deviance. Big issue. We don't address it. And look, we don't recognize it. And some of the stuff that we've been talking about can be mitigated by well-educated players in the field.
Well, and I think
help.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to make sure we brought this up, because, and I'm glad you pointed this out, and I hope that Jeff can confirm that the screen is being shared, and you're able to see it, because to me, as a technologist, there are few risks greater to this industry, profession, ecosystem than this problem.
Discipline.
Right? Discipline, good one. There are. I often refer kind of in passing, I guess, or in writing and rhetoric, to mobile medicine seat at the healthcare table of tomorrow. Right? This industry deserves and must be a part of that conversation. And it's being overlooked chronically. It was overlooked at 2 healthcare conferences in the last 2 weeks, the HIMSS conference and the VIVE conference, which is a combination of the health conference and the College of Health Information Management Executives, which did this event. And there were only 2 people that I heard of at the entire conference who even mentioned out of hospital care. And that was how they referred to it, as the context of opioids, right? So
again, look, we talk about degrees, and even some of the people that are against requiring degrees will admit having one is how you get a seat at the table. Having one is how you get some parity and recognition.
And I'm okay with that. What I have,
let me finish, because there's another pathway.
Go ahead.
And that is being there, going, showing up, being a person that's in the room whenever this, let's say NEMSAC, how many people actually know that NEMSAC, the National EMS Advisory Council, exists, who's on it, and what it is that they do? You mentioned FACPE. NEMSAC makes recommendations as an advisory council to FACPE. FACPE is made up of anybody in the federal government that has a bite at the EMS apple. Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, Health and Human Services. Who else? There's others. I don't, maybe education. There's like 4 or 5. And I've been there and done that. And even I don't even remember what all the players are. So we have a great degree of colloquial ignorance. So when you're talking about how do you change things, first of all, you have to know what those things are. When you're looking at wicked problems or messes, as a guy named Russell Acuff used to talk about, you have to have an understanding of the current environment within which the problems exist. And we don't have that right now. I don't think we have a good understanding of the broad environment, because I think we frequently are limited in our perspectives.
Sure.
And now you cycle all the way back around to how do you get a broader perspective? Well, maybe you have to know things about sociology, psychology, economics, ethics and business to understand more about what's going on in our environment. We have a broken, when you start talking industry, we have the people that are public safety, and I don't like that term, and I'm going to say this: we need to stop saying that EMS lives at the intersection of public safety, healthcare, and public health. We need to define our own domain and our own environment. But you've got the people that are for-profit, non-municipal is what we call them here, because they're not municipal ambulances. You have the various different ways of getting people to the hospital or from one place to another, and we don't do the same stuff. And it makes it really difficult. You have different interests. So when you get to wicked problems, you have a whole number of stakeholders that we never talk to, and many of them are in conflict, right? So the fire service, the hospitals, the doctors, the payers. Nobody ever talks about the payers. Who talks about the public? We need to have all these people involved. Normalization of deviance is easy when you have people that continue to practice without guidelines and standards and figure that they can, well, it's okay if we vary this much until the rocket blows up.
Well, and that's why I'm so glad you mentioned it. And I was thrilled just now to be able to bring this article up from IAFF, right? And I think to the degree that we're going to talk about this on the patient care side, and maybe this will be a last point here, happy to do a part 2, of course, with you, or a part 3, 4, and 5 with you, my friend. But I'll take you up on it. To the degree that I wanted to see if there's any questions, just tell us. But it's interesting that we talk about fire science, right? That is a defined thing, right? But we talk about the art of medicine, right? And so to the degree that we've almost built into the vernacular itself this idea that science has a process, science is repetitive, it must be replicable, right? It is rigid. Art is not. Right, art involves there is a higher tolerance for error. There is the recognition that circumstances, being what they are going to require you to do this or that which you didn't necessarily plan for. Stochastics are real, for stochastics being the reality of randomness, right? But at the same time,
predictability too. Stochastics has to do with predictability or lack thereof.
Exactly, and so are we again preparing people? And how, and more importantly, I'm interested in why. And let this be the last point for the moment. But here, let me see what he put in the chat here. Suddenly, here we go. So to me, the real question of what do we need to do to institutionalize knowledge on the mobile medicine side that allows people to say, I don't know what I don't know. So to the degree that you mentioned the drift, right? And to me, I'm a fairly intelligent person. I'm the least smart of the 3 people on this particular call.
That's arguable.
But but I'm a fairly intelligent person. I've been doing this for a dozen years now, and I still haven't figured it out. And I think, so I am kind of deferring to you. If you have a reference of best practice, maybe we spark a conversation around that, or spark a fire, no pun intended, where folks, sort of race to take care of this, because it is a serious issue. And as the rest of the healthcare system shifts, right, new standards of interoperability, there is something, speaking of FHIR, everyone should look up, called FHIR, F-H-I-R, right? And I'll just bring this up on here on this, right? So which stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. This is the new federally standardized mechanism for sharing information. Like, how many people know about that? We have, I responded to an RFP around data sharing where someone said they wanted an HL7 structure. I said, well, which version of HL7? And their response was, there's more than one, question mark, right? And well, if you don't know what you're asking for, how can you expect to do anything but get lied to, right? And so we need mechanisms by which to have knowledge transfer and have it be consistent. And other than using learning management systems, which are built into themselves, and there are conference after conference about clinical stuff, but NEMSI is all about educators, right? What process does NEMSI have? You mentioned you worked with NEMSI. What process is there at the highest levels of the smartest people in this discipline to make sure that when person number 2 shows up after person number 1 and person 3 after person 2, that there is a foundational knowledge that they have on how to put fingers on keyboards, as much as it is to put tubes down throats, when the fingers on keyboards happens more frequently than the tubes down throats. And that's the part I haven't solved.
So let me say this, and this is kind of my crusade.
Please,
I've talked about it for years. And what I believe we need to do is follow the precepts of identifying and developing an understanding of our current environment by convening a group of stakeholders, the broadest group of stakeholders that we can, and have them dedicated first to learning design thinking and learning problem identification, root cause analysis of substantial issues, so that we first know where we are. We haven't got a map. We haven't got a compass. We haven't got a destination. And we don't even know what we're on. Are we on a ship or on a bus, or are we walking? So all of these
why,
things.
right? Why are we in that boat? Why, again, there's a lot of really, really smart people in this occupation, ecosystem, et cetera. How does one go? 50 years is 2 generations. So how do we go 2 generations and find oneself spinning in a vortex, right? Not just up a river,
looking the whole time.
Because what?
We've been inward looking the whole time.
Okay.
We never knew what we were doing. All we knew is that you got to understand the historical origins of what it is that we do. And we have evolved past the historical origins in practice, but not in preparation. So a paramedic was originally designed to only be the hands, eyes, ears of a physician extender into somebody's living room.
Paramedic.
Yeah. So you didn't have to know why. You just had to be able to follow orders. And I was around during the days when you had to call medical command for online medical control, where you provided the details of your physical exam and interview to a physician, and then they decided what it was that you needed to do. And then you followed those orders. And in some places, it's still the case that you cannot initiate invasive therapy or pharmacological interventions without a physician's order, sometimes referred to as a mother may I system. Nothing much has changed in the curriculum as to how to make a paramedic, but paramedic practice has changed, where most often paramedics practice under distributed medical command or indirect medical command based on protocol. So you do your physical exam, you do your interview, you make a diagnosis, which people have been arguing about whether paramedics make diagnoses or not for a long time. But I would suggest that because we now collect data, make a decision, and implement a response, initiating care, it's not deep in scope, or it's a very narrow scope, what we do. But we do it on our own. We're an unrecognized independent practitioner. You don't call a physician unless stuff's going sideways. And a lot of people don't even bother. They just load and go, right? So all of this goes to suggest that as the practice has evolved, the preparation for that practice has not. And I would go with the ideas that what it is education needed to fill those gaps about all those things we just talked about a while ago. Bias, social determinants of health, real understanding. How many paramedics really understand the quality of improvement practice that's been around, since Deming and Duran in the late 40s after World War II, how to get things done. And, one of the things about, I call it Six Sigma, or call it, continuous quality improvement. You have to really recognize the fact that they were based on industrial processes.
Yep.
They were based on statistical process control. And when you throw people into that mix on both sides of the equation, it becomes much more complex. So now we're thrown all the way back to the idea of complexity and how do you ask the right questions. So first, you have to know where you are. We have to create the map. We have to illuminate the landscape. So far, we've been very myopic in our discussion and description of the landscape within which we work and live. And we've been very contentious about who owns this plot of land and who's responsible and who gets the money and so on and so forth. We need to step away from that. We need to, in my opinion, we need to stop saying we need to think outside the box and recognize we don't even know what the box is.
Yeah.
There is no box.
So
start from scratch. We don't stop what we're doing, but we build a new foundation because, the ACOF theory is you don't solve problems when they're this complex. You create an environment within which those so-called problems can exist. And we haven't come anywhere close to that. Because when you look at the conversations are all insiders, all looking inward. We need to expand and do more like what, the Greeks talked about. We need geographers and philosophers, as a representation of a broader interdisciplinary approach. There's a lot we can learn, for instance, from the hospitality industry.
And so let me throw one last question to you. Jeff will kill me, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Well, he said we can keep going.
Well, since you mentioned quality control and then you mentioned people, and when you put those two together, I think you end up at something you mentioned in a bit of a shorthand that I'd like you to expound upon, which is design thinking. Because the secret to ensuring that people go down the path you're intending them to go down is design, right? I remember when I was at Carnegie Mellon in the business school, and I took, CMU's human computer interface courses are kind of legendary. I took some design classes, and I never understood at the time when we were talking about utility of an egg timer, things like that, just how meaningful that conversation would be, whether it's ergonomics on bodies or it's human computer interface. How do you drive people to an objective you're trying to get them to? But the ability to make that process intuitive, repetitive, where you can learn it, where you can transmit it, where it's not going to be the worst thing you've ever done. Why do you hone in on design thinking? What gap do you just define design thinking anyway, as if it's, especially if it's different from what I just said, but what gap do you think that would fit? Because that could end up being a missing link in this whole process as we look to what's next.
Well, first you have to have a high level understanding of systems and the system of systems. So emergency medical service was originally conceived of as not EMS, but EMSS, emergency medical services systems. And we don't understand our systems well at all. When you're talking about wicked problems, you talk about what you think is a problem and you work to solve it, maybe something that is going to make my world worse. So design thinking is based on a foundation of a good understanding of the systems and what's actually happening, right? What is the environment? And then you make new stuff to come to a product or an outcome that solves or serves the purposes that you're trying to serve, not exactly solving a problem. So what is it? We're trying to provide certain services to the public, primarily historically a ride to the hospital. Everything was based around a ride to the hospital, period. We were reimbursed. You could have a whole conversation about the idea of reimbursement, terrible way of doing business. And that we're a transportation provider, not a healthcare service, right? So we have to know what it is that we should be doing from a broader perspective. What are the services that the public need? What are the services that the public wants? And we don't have the answer to that. Everything has been historically based on a ride to the hospital. And that's, and the original concept was based on taking care of emergencies, which are a very small portion of the stuff that we do. And then you look in the historical documents, Galaxy Quest, right? We looked at the historical documents. It was only based on guys that fell off ladders or crashed cars. And then it was, to make a paramedic, it was about intervening in cardiac arrest. You go back and you look at Pantridge's article in Lancet, and I guess it was 1965 or 69, where we decided that he could save more lives of people having a heart attack by going out to their house rather than waiting for them to show up. And that got picked up in Florida and in Oregon or in Seattle. But anyway, that's not what we do anymore. It's not just what we do. We don't just respond to car wrecks and heart attacks. We do a lot more. So I think we need to set aside all of our preconceived ideas about what it is that we do and look with a clean slate and talk to more of the people that have a stake in what it is that happens. And we don't currently do that. So.
Well, I feel like that's an aspirational thought, a perfect one on which to pause this conversation. I say pause because with you and me, it's never going to end. So it's really just until the next installment. But I do think that that's a very hopeful approach, right? We are seeing people, we are seeing the topic come up in conversation. I've described convergence as my buzzword for 2021. Not 2022, we'll see what comes, right? But to the degree that 2020, we're not wasting a good pandemic, and it really collapsed a lot of the silos, right? So now we're starting to have a recognition in a lot of different places about the fact that this took a group effort.
Let me throw this out as a last thought because it's coming up. EMS on the Hill Day is coming up, where you can engage with your federal legislators. That's where it all happens. That's where they control the money. And they really don't know what we do. You can be active locally, politically, if you're not restricted like I used to be, active in the state level. Emergency medical services is regulated by the states. And if we want to get proper funding and proper recognition and, designated as an essential service, so many other things, we have to engage politically. We have to engage with our legislators. So to get to where we can actually convene this conversation, we need to have somebody who's willing to kick up the money to do it. And it's going to cost. You have to have people willing to spend the money and people willing to invest the time.
But the juice is worth the squeeze.
Say again?
The juice is worth the squeeze.
Right. So that's the challenge I would throw out at people is look up some of this stuff, look up wicked problems, look up this aspect of of pedagogy and andragogy. Look up the history of EMS. How many people know where we came from? And then, you know, educate your legislators, the people who represent us to government and control the dollars. And maybe we can get some money to do things differently.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me.
Your brilliance is unparalleled. I tell you, Mike, I not only do I learn stuff from you every time we talk, but there are a few people who can throw out references the way you do. It's one thing to name drop celebrities and bold-faced names. It's another thing to name drop authors and journal articles. So you have a unique talent, brother. Thank you to everybody who watched today. Please do engage with us through social media channels. We're all quite findable. My email, first name dot last name at beyondlucid.com. If you're prefer to do it that way, with any topics for future discussions. And thank you to Jeff Frankel and the team at JEMS for allowing us to engage in yet another wide-ranging and hopefully productive and inspiring conversation. Thanks to everybody. Stay safe.
Thanks so much.